Hey guys, welcome to a new video. Like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy. Without any further interruptions, enjoy the What If. Chapter 1. Romance Dawn. In the party bar in Fuchsia Village, a group of pirates could be seen drinking and having a good time. Sitting at the bar is a young 7-year-old boy named Monkey D. Luffy, and next to him is a red-haired man with a straw hat eating a plate of food. Hey, you have to take me with you on your next adventure, Shanks. I want to be a pirate just like you, Luffy said with a huge smile on his face while looking at the red-haired man now named Shanks. Shanks looked up from his food and turned towards Luffy and started laughing. Ha 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 ha, right as if you could ever be a pirate, Shanks said. Why couldn't I? Luffy asked. A large man eating a piece of meat answered his question. Listen Luffy, you may be a good swimmer and all, but that doesn't mean you will make a good pirate, said Lucky Roo while eating his meat. But I'm a great fighter too, my punches are like 2 pistols, he said as he held out his fist for them to see. It was an amusing sight to see for everyone else in the bar. Are they now? Said Shanks with a mouth full of food. What's that supposed to mean? Luffy yelled. Lucky Roo laughed and spoke. He means you are too much of a kid, he said. And he is right, you know, I got boys older than you, said Usopp. A tick mark formed on Luffy's forehead before he starting to yell at them. I'm not a kid, I'm a grown-up, he screamed at the top of the lungs. He was brought out of his screaming by Shanks' voice. Here, have some juice and clam down, Shanks said as she slid a glass of what appears to be orange juice over to Luffy. Luffy's eyes lit up and he got a huge smile on his face. Wow, thanks, Shanks, he said as he began to drink the juice. As he started drinking, Shanks starting laughing at him while hitting the bar counter. I don't know one pirate who drinks juice, Shanks said while laughing. That's a dirty trick, Luffy screamed, causing everyone at the bar to burst out laughing. Stop laughing. That was a cheap shot, he screamed at the rest of the pirates. While all of this is going on, the owner of the bar, Makino, is watching the interaction between Luffy and the pirates with a warm smile on her face. Suddenly the doors of the bar were kicked off of its hinges and came flying into the bar. Excuse us, said the tall man standing in front of the door. At this point, the entire bar was silent while looking at the door. The man who was leading the group of other men into the bar was a tall, dark-skinned man with black hair, a black goatee, and an X-shaped scar above his right eye. He wore a long red coat over a white shirt, black trousers, and a golden necklace. So these are what passes for pirates around these parts. Looks rather sad, to be honest, he said as he walked up to the bar counter and stood next to Shanks. Welcome gentlemen, what can I do for you? Asked Makino. We're mountain bandits, but we didn't come here to tear your place apart. All we want is some sake. Let's say 10 barrels should do, he said to Makino. I'm sorry, but actually we are fresh out of sake right now, Makino said. After the mountain bandit had said he didn't come to terrorize the bar, Luffy tuned out and turned his attention elsewhere because in his opinion a mountain bandit ordering sake was boring. So, he turned to his right at the chest sitting on the counter of the bar. He knew it belonged Shanks because he saw when they brought it in with them. His mind immediately began to race with ideas after ideas about what may be inside of the chest. So, he decided to satisfy his curiosity and look inside. It was somewhat disappointing because inside of the chest wasn't any treasure like Luffy had hoped it would be, instead it was a strange-looking fruit. It was a light blue fruit shaped like a really big pear with darker blue swirls on it. At that very same time, Luffy's stomach growled, so he decided to eat the fruit. Luffy being Luffy, instead of taking a small bit of the fruit to see what it takes, like he places the entire thing in his mouth and bit down. He instantly regretted it. That was the most disgusting thing Luffy had ever eaten. However, he did not spit it out, instead he swallowed. At the same time, he was startled when something large fell beside him. He looked over to see Shanks laying on the ground while the mountain bandit was screaming some nonsense about being worth 8 million belly. Luffy immediately jumped up on the bar stool that he was sitting on and screamed at the bandits. Leave Shanks alone, he screamed at the bandit while unconsciously releasing a wave of unknown power. When Luffy did this, the strangest thing happened. One by one the mountain bandits started passing out along with a few weaker members of Shanks' crew. Shanks and the rest of the crew that were awake had their eyes widened while the leader of the mountain bandits was shaking in his boots. What did you do, brat? He yelled, asked Luffy. Luffy for his part looked shocked and confused about what had just happened. There is no doubt about it. That was the conqueror's spirit. Shanks, first mate Ben Beckman thought to himself before making eye contact with his captain, who nodded to him. Before anyone could have reacted, the mountain bandit leader took out his sword and swung it to chop Luffy in half while screaming at the top of his voice. I am going to kill you, brat. He yelled as the sword began to descend towards Luffy. Shanks, who was still on the ground, couldn't react fast enough even though he tried, but stopped halfway because of what happened next. The sword cut through Luffy's shoulder and made its way to his chest, but stopped there when sparks of lightning came from Luffy's body and electrocuted the bandit. The sword fell out of Luffy's chest when the bandit began to fall to the ground as well. Everyone in the bar started at Luffy as the huge cut from his shoulder to his chest began to come together again with the sight of lighting present in the gap. No one said a word, they all stared at the small 7-year-old boy. Everyone was brought out of their staring by Shanks' voice. Luffy, did you eat the fruit that was inside of the chest? He asked, to which Luffy nodded. Shanks then tried to grab Luffy by the shoulder only to have his hand pass right through Luffy and get a serious electric shock at the same time. Shanks immediately pulled his hand back. He then looked at Luffy before he spoke. Luffy, you just ate the rumble fruit, part of a group called the devil fruits. Eating any of them takes away your ability to swim for the rest of your life, but the one you ate is a Logia class devil fruit, meaning now you can turn your body into lightning and become lightning. Shanks yelled. Luffy for his part had stars in his eyes at the idea of becoming lightning. Does this mean I can come with you now? Asked a very hopeful Luffy. Shanks went to take his seat at the bar again before he was joined by his first mate, who signaled Makino to join them before they began whispering so Luffy couldn't hear. Captain, he just ate a Logia class devil fruit and one of the more powerful ones at that, said Ben Beckman, plus Conqueror's Haki. If he doesn't learn how to control his powers, he could seriously hurt someone. He finished while Shanks took on a serious look and Makino a more worried one. Is he going to be all right? As a worried Makino, Shanks looked at her and smiled before speaking. Yea, he will, don't worry. The three of them were brought out of their whispering when Luffy screamed at them. Hey, stop whispering, I can't hear what you are saying. Luffy yelled, causing them to break apart. He then turned to Shanks before speaking again. So, can I come with you guys, Shanks? He asked again, making Shanks turn to look at him before speaking. I will decide if I will take after you answer 2 questions. Okay, said Shanks, to which Luffy nodded. The first question, do you know what you did to knock out those bandits? Shanks asked, causing everyone in the bar to quiet down to hear Luffy's answer. No, I don't know how I did it. It usually just happens when Grandpa is training me, said Luffy, to which Shanks nodded with his eyes closed before his eyes shot open in surprise. You mean you used it before? He asked in surprise. Luffy just nodded. Yea, against some monkeys Grandpa had me fight during my training, said casually as though it was noting while everyone else looked at him wide-eyed except for Makino. Who has a 7-year-old fight monkey as a part of training? Every pirate thought to themselves. Shanks then turned towards Makino and asked her a question. Who was Luffy's grandpa? Shanks asked, to which Makino took on a sinister look before she spoke. Monkey D. Garp, she said, causing the entire bar to freeze and looked at her with their eyes widen. You mean Garp, the fist, is his grandfather? Shanks yelled out, to causing Makino to giggle before nodding. Shanks began to calm himself down before turning back towards Luffy, who was picking his nose, causing everyone to sweat drop. Okay, Luffy's second question. Shanks said, getting Luffy's attention. What's your dream? Shanks asked, to which Luffy took on a huge smile before he stood up on the stool and yelled out at the top of his lungs. My dream is to be king of pirates. He yelled. And why king of the pirates? Shanks asked. Because the king of the pirates is the man with the most freedom, said Luffy, surprising everyone. Just you wait, I am going to have the greatest adventure and find the One Piece and become king of the pirates, Luffy said with a lot of determination in his voice, causing everyone to smile and Shanks to see an image of his old captain Galdi Roger behind Luffy. Well, Luffy, Shanks said, getting Luffy's attention, welcome to the crew, he said, causing everyone to begin cheering and Luffy to start crying. A week had passed since Shanks agreed to take Luffy with them. Currently, the entire village was at the docks to say goodbye to Luffy and the pirates. At first, the mayor did not agree to Luffy leaving, but after Ben and Shanks explained to him how dangerous it will if Luffy doesn't learn how to control his powers, he understood and agreed, but made it clear that Makino would be the one to tell Garp when he comes back to the village. Another thing that happened during the week was that Shanks had sent one of his crew member who didn't have a bounty on his head to cash in the bounty of the mountain bandits and give it to Luffy. Luffy, who was currently on Shanks's ship, read Force waving goodbye to the villagers before he screamed out, "Bye Makino, I'll come back before I set out on my own," he yells as the ship sailed further away from the island. With the island now out of sight, Shanks began giving orders to the crew. "Okay guys, no stop, we have enough supplies to last us, so set a course for the Grand Line," he said. "Aye Captain," replied everyone. Shanks then turned towards Luffy, who was looking around with a huge smile on his face, causing Shanks to chuckle. "Luffy," yelled Shanks, getting Luffy's attention. "Come with me," he said as he began walking towards what appears to be the sleeping quarters. "This is where you will sleep," Shanks said, indicating to the room with a single bed, desk, and closet inside. It wasn't a big room, but at the same time, it was big enough for one adult person. Luffy looked around and noticed his stuff was already in there waiting for him. He stepped inside and smiled. "I love it," he said, causing Shanks to smile. "Okay, Luffy, let me tell you how things are going to happen once we enter the Grand Line," Shanks said, getting Luffy's attention. Luffy also noticed that Ben, Roo, and Usopp were standing by the doorway. "First thing that will happen is Lucy Roo is going to teach you how to control that devil fruit of yours a bit. Then from there every day in the morning Ben is going to teach you navigation and history along with battle strategy and anything else he comes up with. That will be for about 3 hours a day every day. The rest of the day is either spend with me teaching you hockey or Usopp teaching you how to shoot. Whatever extra time you have you will train to master your devil fruit powers, or you can do that after you either master hockey or sharp shooting." "Understood?" asked Shanks, to which Luffy nodded and spoke. "Yep, now I have one question," he said, to which Shanks nodded for him to proceed. "Do you have any meat?" he said, causing the four of them to comically fall over. After Shanks had explained everything to Luffy again to make sure he understood, he began to explain to Luffy what hockey was and how it may be useful in combat. To say that Luffy liked the idea was an understatement. Luffy kept begging Shanks over and over to start his training until Shanks finally caved and started teaching him observation hockey. It had been 3 days since the crew left Dawn Island and the entrance to the Grand Line was in sight. Luffy was excited at the thought of sailing up a mountain. As the ship began ascending the mountain and peak was becoming visible, Luffy dashed to the front of the ship and began climbing to stand on the figurehead. Everyone saw this and began to get scared when Luffy finally stood on the figurehead. As the ship reached the peak and began descending into the Grand Line, Luffy stretched out his arms and screamed to the heavens. "I am going to be the king of the pirates," he screamed, causing everyone on board to smile at the determination in the young 7-year-old. Chapter 2. Farewells in Kobe. Timeskip. 10 years later, on an island in the New World. On a small island in the New World, a pirate ship could be seen docked close to the island. On the shores of the island, a large group of people could be seen standing with their backs towards the sea while looking at a man standing in front of them. This man was the now 17-year-old Monkey D. Luffy. Luffy was now 6 feet 5 and well built. He was wearing long black pants with a pair of steel-tipped boots and a crimson-red dress shirt with the top 3 buttons opened, revealing a necklace with a lightning bolt pendant. Strapped with a black cloth around his waist was a katana with a black and white diamond pattern handle hanging off the left side of his hip. And to top everything off was the thing he treasures more than his own life resting on his head, the straw hat that Shanks gave to him. Everyone from the red-haired pirates was gathered on the shore today to see Luffy off to start his own adventure. "I want to thank you guys for all you have done for me over the past 10 years, and I am truly grateful for all you have taught me," said Luffy while looking at everyone. "Ah, don't sweat it, Luffy," said Lucky Roo, who was walking over to Luffy carrying 2 large barrels on his shoulder while somehow able to hold a piece of meat in his hands as well. "Here, got you something for the trip," he said as he placed the barrels down. "There should be enough meat and booze in there to last you the trip to the East Blue," he finished. Luffy smiled at him and thanked him for the food. As Lucky Roo was walking back to stand with the rest of the crew, Usopp began walking towards Luffy. "Hey Lou, I got a bit of a going-away present here for you," Usopp said as he pulled out a medium box from his coat and handed it to Luffy. Luffy took it and looked at the nice wrapping around the box before he spoke. "Usopp, you really didn't have to do this. You guys have done way more for me than anyone ever had," Luffy said. "Nonsense kid, we're a family and you can never do too much for your family," Usopp said while patting Luffy on the back. Luffy smiled and opened the box to see a black and red flintlock pistol. "It is Doflamingo's gun, only black and red instead of black and gold." Luffy held the gun in his hand and looked in the box to see the holster. He strapped the holster around the waist so the gun would be on his right side. Luffy then took on a puzzled look on his face. He had a gun in a holster, but no ammo. He looked over to Usopp and spoke. "I don't see any ammo in the box and there is none loaded into the gun. Am I going to have to buy some?" Luffy asked, genuinely confused. He looked around to see everyone else confused just as he was. He then looked at Usopp to see him with a wide smile on his face. "No, you don't have to buy ammo for this gun. Never will," he said, adding to the confusion of Luffy and everyone else there, "This is a special gun made especially for you. I always wanted one, but even if I bought one for myself I won't be able to use it. You see, this gun is powered by your devil fruit and in your case, it will not fire regular bullets but instead, it will fire your lightning as bullets," Usopp said, surprising everyone there and causing Luffy's eyes to widen. "I never knew they made weapons like this," Luffy said as he looked at the gun in his hand. He was brought out of his admiring by Usopp's voice. "Before you can use it you need it to register your devil fruit. So, channel some of your lightning into the gun," he said. Luffy held out the gun and began channeling his lightning powers into the gun and soon the entire gun was covered with lighting. He then looked to Usopp who nodded to him to stop with he did only to see the excess lightning get absorbed into the gun. "There, that should do it. Try shooting this," he said as he pulled out an empty sake bottle and tossed it into the air. Luffy held the gun in his right hand, aimed it at the bottle, and pulled the trigger. Out of the gun came a bolt of lighting that moved faster than anyone other than Luffy could see, racing towards the empty bottle in the air. Upon impact, the bolt of lightning didn't just shatter the bottle and continue on its path as everyone expected. It hit the bottle and exploded. Everyone was stunned at what they just witnessed. Luffy, wanting to test something out, he aimed the gun at a nearby tree, compressed his lightning, and then he pulled the trigger. Like before, a bolt of lightning raced out of the gun towards the tree. However, this time it pierced through the tree before doing the same to 5 more trees behind it before it finally exploded, destroying the last tree in the process. "What did you do differently there, Luffy, to make it pierce through all those trees?" asked Shanks. Luffy placed the pistol in the holster and turned towards Shanks before speaking. "I simply compressed the lightning a bit more this time, but I didn't expect it to do that much damage," he said before turning towards Usopp and continue. "Thanks Usopp, I love it," Luffy said with a huge grin on his face. Usopp smiled at him and patted him on the back before leaving to go stand with the rest of the crew. While he was walking back, Shanks started walking towards Luffy with a parcel in his hands. He didn't say anything, he just handed it to Luffy and stood there. Luffy looked at it with a smile on his face before he opened the wrapping to see a coat folded inside. He took the coat out to examine it to see that it was a black and gold captain's coat. Think Gold Roger's coat, only black instead of red. Luffy then took the coat and placed it on. He wore it the way he saw every other captain of a pirate crew wearing theirs, just resting on his shoulders. Luffy looked at Shanks and spoke. "Thanks, Shanks, I love it. It fits perfect," he said with a smile. Shanks smiled at him and replied, "It's nothing, Anchor. If you are going to be captain of your own crew, might as well look the part," Shanks said with a chuckle. "Again, thank you guys for everything. Without you guys, I don't know where I would be, or if I would have learned the things I learned with you guys over the past 10 years. Luffy said as he looked at everyone, a bit teary eyes. He then wiped his eyes and took on a more serious look on his face as he looked to the sky and began concentrating. In the sky above, everyone could see a thundercloud starting to form. It then started to increase in size, getting bigger and bigger until everyone realized something. It wasn't getting bigger, it was getting closer to them. Everyone was wondering what in the world was Luffy doing. The cloud finally came down and hovered just about a half of a foot above the ground. It was a dark thundercloud about the size of a small 6-person boat. Luffy then walked over to the 2 barrels he got from Lucky Roo, picked them up and placed them on the cloud. They sank down a few inches before staying in place. Everyone's eyes were wide. "That's your ride," they all screamed. Luffy looked at them and gave them a wide grin. "You betcha," he said with giving them a thumbs up. He then placed the rest of his stuff on the cloud. He then began concentrating on the cloud once more, and from the cloud, a lounge chair began to form. Luffy then climbs onto the cloud and sat on the chair before turning towards the group to speak. "I should re-enter the Grand Line by the end of the month. When I see you guys again I'll be a famous pirate," said Luffy smiling. Everyone gave him a warm smile. "I'll be looking out for you, Anchor," said Shanks. "We all will," said Ben. Luffy then waved at them and began speaking. "Bye guys. Thanks for everything again," he said. As he said that, the cloud he was riding on began ascending into the air before it shot forward and began climbing to higher altitude. Everyone just stared at the flying Luffy and waved. "I'm going to miss that kid," said Usopp. Everyone just nodded their heads in agreement. Luffy, who was laying in his lounge chair made out of clouds, was just relaxing and enjoying the scenery of the world below him. He was traveling at about 65 miles per hour and was about 20,000 feet in the air. At first, it was a bit hard to breathe, but after a couple of minutes, Luffy got used to the thin oxygen that was present that high up. On his journey, Luffy could see various small sky islands with people on them. Some waved at him he waved back, while others were wary of him, so they ran into their homes and hid. Luffy didn't really care. All he did was continue on his journey to the East Blue. It would take him about 1 day to reach the East Blue, or less than a day if he decides he wants to go faster. For now, Luffy is just enjoying the relaxing ride. "So, this is the Holy Land Mariajoy," Luffy said as he stopped the cloud and have it hover high over the capital of the world government, where no one will be able to see him. He had been traveling for about 6 hours now and finally reached the Red Line. Seeing as how he can fly with the cloud, he didn't need to go down to Fishman Island, he could just fly over the Red Line. Luffy couldn't help but admire the city. Even though he didn't like the bastards in the world government, he couldn't deny it was a beautiful city with amazing architecture. "Well, I am not here to admire the sights, I have places to be," Luffy said as he narrowed his eyes forward and concentrated on the lightning in the thundercloud before blasting off a lot faster than which he was moving at first. Luffy now entered paradise, traveling at a speed of 100 miles per hour. He had taken off his straw hat because he didn't want it getting blown away. At this speed, Luffy is estimated to arrive in the East Blue in about 3 hours. Time skip. 3 hours later. Luffy is now in the East Blue after being gone for 10 years. He immediately slowed the cloud down to only about 40 miles per hour and lowered the altitude to just about enough so he could see the world below him quite clearly. "Feels good to be back home. First stop Maki no Nichan, then off to find a crew," Luffy said as he began traveling towards Dawn Island. After traveling for about an hour, Luffy finally arrived at a familiar island where he flew his cloud onto the docks before stepping off. As Luffy stepped off, he turned to the cloud and it began to hover higher and higher until it finally disappears into the other clouds present in the sky. Luffy then turned around to see that he had attracted a crowd. The man standing in front of the crowd was someone Luffy remembered quite vividly. He was Mayor Whoop Slap. He has a cleft chin, wears oval glasses, has a mustache and a beard, and held a cane on his hand. Luffy smiled at the man and began walking towards the crowd. "Who are you? Are you a pirate?" asked the mayor while pointing his cane at Luffy. Luffy took on an amused look on his face before he answered. "Yes, I am a pirate," Luffy said, doing very little to hide his amusement. "However, you can relax, Mayor, I mean you no harm. I am just here to see my older sister," Luffy said, confusing everyone there who was wondering who was his sister. Before they could have questioned him, Luffy began walking towards Makino's bar, knowing full well he had a crowd following him. As he reached the bar, he walked inside and sat in the same seat he sat in 10 years ago when Shanks was there. Makino was not by the bar, so he assumed she was in the back. He was a few minutes before she finally came out. When she saw a young man sitting at the counter, she went to him and spoke. "Good afternoon, sir, is there anything I can help you with?" Makino said. Luffy gave her his famous grin before answering. Yes, a large tub of meat and some sake. Maki no Nichan, Luffy said while grinning. As he said that he heard gasps from behind him and one from Makino as well as he covered her mouth with her hand and started tearing up before she launched herself over the counter surprising Luffy and the crowd that followed him. As she launched herself she screamed at the top of her voice. LLUUFFYY. She screamed as she crashed into Luffy knocking him off the stool before hugging him and crying into his chest. Luffy, you came back like you said. I missed you, she said as she sniffled a bit. She finally got off of him and helped him up before she ran into the back and came back out with a large tub of meat and a bottle of sake. She set it down in front of where he sat at the counter before she went around the counter and sat next to him before speaking. Tell me, how was your trip with Shanks? Where did you go? What did you see? Tell me everything, Makino said excitedly. Luffy chuckled at her antics and was about to answer, but before he could, the entire crowd that followed him into the bar screamed out. Luffy's back. They screamed as they all pulled out mugs of booze from what appears out of nowhere and began sitting around the bar to hear Luffy's stories. Luffy chuckled and began telling them stories of his time with Shanks. Luffy stayed in Fuchsia village for 3 days before he decided to set out to find a crew. Currently, Luffy was standing at the same docks where he arrived at with the entire village standing there to see him off. Luffy was currently looking up into the sky calling the thundercloud that had all of his stuff. Soon out of the clouds everyone saw a single thundercloud come out and began descending towards Luffy. The cloud then pulled up beside the dock as if it were a ship docking there and Luffy stepped on it. Luffy then turned towards the group of villagers and spoke. Bye guys, I will see you guys when I am king of the pirates, Luffy said as he waved with a huge smile on his as the cloud began to pull away. Be safe Luffy, I'll be checking the newspaper every day to see what you've been up to. Makino shouted as Luffy was pulling away. Luffy gave her a thumbs up before dashing away. He kept the cloud just 10 feet above the water and had it sailed at a slow speed of 25 miles per hour. While sailing, a Sea King rose from the water and tried to attack Luffy, but Luffy simply sent a blast of Conqueror's Haki and knocked the beat out before continuing his way. Luffy now shifted his chair into a throne with lightning sparks occasionally coming off of it and his face took on a more serious impassive look. Gone was the happy-go-lucky Luffy, this was Captain Luffy. Luffy then spoke in a tone that would send chills down his enemy's spine. Time to turn this world upside down, he said. After traveling for about 10 minutes Luffy was startled by the sounds of cannon fire coming from the starboard side of the cloud. He looked to see who was shooting at what and that's when he saw the ugliest pirate ship he had ever seen in his life. The ship was a large pink ship, with 4 sails, one higher than the other 3. Each sail has a pink heart, and the ship herself has 2 hearts on each side. The figurehead is a duck and the Jolly Roger of a skull is depicted from the side and has a pink heart on it. The ship was currently attacking a civilian vessel. I wonder if anyone there has a bounty on their heads. Luffy wondered as he turned the cloud and head towards the pirate ship. As the cloud pulled up beside the pink ship, Luffy had it stay hidden just off the side before he stood up and turned his body into lighting before teleporting to the deck of the ship. All the pirates and civilians saw was lightning struck the ship while a loud thunder sounded in the clear blue sky, and now standing in the spot where the lightning had struck is a man with a captain's coat hung on his shoulders and a straw hat on his head. Everything about the man radiated power. His gaze if cold enough to freeze the sun and his aura was strong enough to make seasoned fighters cower in fear. No one said a word, they all just stared at the man in fear. The silence lasted about 2 minutes before what appears to be a fat, ugly woman spoke. Who are you and why are you on my ship? She screamed at the man, trying to act bravely in front of her men on the outside while in the inside she was shaking her boots. I was simply wondering who was the captain of this hideous vessel, he said as he looked around while using his observation haki to sense around the ship. He sensed a girl in the lower levels robbing these pirates. He couldn't help but chuckle. He was brought out his observing when the fat lady spoke. Are you the pirate hunter Roronoa Zoro? She asked, which earned her a raised eyebrow from Luffy before he replied. No, can't say that I am. Who might you be? Luffy asked, genuinely curious about who she was and whether or not she had a bounty. I am the most beautiful woman of all the seas, she said as she placed her iron club on her shoulders before continuing, the one and only, Iron Club, Alvida. She said. When she said that, Luffy couldn't help but burst out laughing. You, the most beautiful woman of all the seas. Luffy said as he started rolling on the floor laughing. Sorry hag, but you ain't nowhere close to being the most beautiful woman of all the seas. Luffy said as he stood up and looked at the woman to see her fuming, but that meant very little to Luffy as he began speaking again. Do you by chance have a bounty on your head? Luffy asked. He saw the woman smirked before answering. Yes, I have a bounty of 5 million berry on my head, she said as Luffy simply sighed. Damn, was hoping it was a bit more. Anyway, time for business. Luffy said as he sent a wave of Conqueror's Haki towards the pirates, effectively knocking out all of them except Alvida and surprisingly a short pink-haired boy who only fell to a knee. Luffy turned to the boy and spoke. You have a strong will to be able to withstand my Haki like that, kid, Luffy said with a smile that made the boy smile as well. Alvida turned to the boy and was about to speak, but never got a chance to, because she was hit square of the jaw by Luffy with a fist coated in lightning, effectively knocking her out. Luffy then placed his palm on her back and spoke. Bind, he said, and then all of a sudden from the palm of his hand 3 rope-like bolts of lightning came out and snaked itself around Alvida, binding her in place. The boy with the pink hair had his eyes popping out of its socket. How did you do that? He asked, screamed. Luffy smiled and answered. I ate a devil fruit, the rumble fruit to be exact. So, now I am a lightning man. Luffy said as he turned his entire right hand into lightning. By the way, what's your name? Luffy asked. Oh, I'm Kobe, sir, Kobe said as Luffy turned his hand back to normal. Nice to meet you, Kobe, my name is Monkey D. Luffy, and I am going to be king of the pirates. Chapter 3. The First Mate. Flying just above the water is Luffy and Kobe sitting in Luffy's thunder cloud. Luffy was sitting on his throne while Kobe was sitting on a small chair Luffy made for him. Following behind Luffy's cloud is a captured Alvida who is on a separate thunder cloud that Luffy summoned to transport her. They are currently headed to Shell's town to cash in the bounty on Alvida's head and also take Kobe there to join the Marines. Even though Kobe wanted to be a Marine, Luffy could honestly say he liked the kid. He had a good sense of justice, and even though he was a bit of a coward, with the right type of training he would become a fine Marine, and Luffy knew just a person to turn him into one. Luffy couldn't stop himself from chuckling at the thought of that man training Kobe. Luffy was brought out of his thought by Kobe's voice. Wow, I still can't believe I am sitting on a cloud, Kobe said happily as he ran his hand on the surface of the cloud. Luffy chuckled at his antics before he spoke. Yay, well, this is a thunder cloud. It is a lot more firm compared to regular clouds found on one of the Sky Islands, Luffy said, making Kobe whipped his head around and looked at Luffy with eyes the size of dinner plates. Why, you mean there are islands in the sky? Kobe asked with a voice of pure shock. Yes, is even a sea of clouds up there that your boats can sail on, Luffy said, surprising Kobe even more. However, I don't know if there is any here in the skies above the East Blue, but I know for a fact they are in the Grand Line. Luffy finished with a smile. Wow, was all Kobe could say. Luffy chuckled at Kobe's reaction before his face became serious as he spoke to Kobe. Hey, Kobe, Luffy said, getting Kobe's attention. Alvida mentioned Roronoa Zoro earlier and I was wondering who was her. Luffy asked, causing Kobe to turn pale. He is a great pirate hunter. He is a man who diced up his bounties like an animal bent on carnage, a bloodthirsty beast. He has been called nothing less than a living, breathing demon in human form. Luffy couldn't help but sweat drop at that description. Recently I heard he was captured and is being held at the Marine base in Shell's town, Kobe said, causing Luffy to grin. When Kobe saw the grin he immediately grew pale. Please don't tell me you are thinking about doing what I think you're thinking about doing. Kobe yelled, but Luffy simply chuckled and didn't reply, making Kobe even more scared. The two of them and an unconscious Alvida traveled for about 5 more minutes before they finally reached the Marine base city. Luffy and Kobe exited the cloud before Luffy sent it up in the sky to wait for him to summon it back when ready. The cloud carrying Alvida followed closely behind Luffy and Kobe as they walked through the town, earning them odd looks from the civilians there. I want to see who this Roronoa Zoro is. Who knows, maybe I'll even have him join my crew, Luffy said with a serious look on his face as they walked through town. When Luffy said that, Kobe immediately began to beg Luffy to find someone else. Luffy, seriously, you are out of your mind if you think the right thing to do is get this guy to join you, said an extremely scared Kobe. Luffy just kept an emotionless look on his face as he spoke. I never said he was going to join my crew. I said maybe he will, Luffy said as he stopped by one of the local vendors that were selling apples and picked one up and bit down on it before flipping the vendor a belly. He then looked to the guy that sold him the apple and spoke, are they really keeping that Zoro guy here? Luffy asked. The moment Zoro's name left his mouth, everyone who was close enough to hear the question jumped back with a look of pure horror on their face. I'll take that as a yes, Luffy said before walking off with Kobe close behind. Maybe we shouldn't mention the name Zoro here, said Kobe in a low voice as he whispered to Luffy. Let us just head to the base. You did say you wanted to become a marine, right? Asked Luffy as they continue walking towards the marine base. Well, of course, I do, Luffy, but I don't feel as though I am ready yet. From what I've heard, the man in charge of this base is named Captain Morgan, said Kobe. Similar to the reaction of Zoro's name, everyone that was within range to hear Morgan's name jumped back and took on a look of pure horror. Luffy narrowed his eyes at this before thinking to himself. It seems this is one of those marine bases. Luffy thought to himself. He looked over to Kobe to see him having a puzzled look on his face. He then looked at Luffy and began to speak. That was odd. I mean, I can understand them being scared of Zoro and all, but why a marine captain? Asked Kobe. Luffy's face then took on a more sympathetic look as he looked at Kobe before he spoke. You will come to understand that in the world we live in you can't believe everything you are told. You must be able to try to see the world for yourself and come to your own conclusion. In my experience and from what I have seen, not all pirates are bad and not all marines are good. Luffy said, surprising Kobe, who looked like he didn't want to believe what was just told to him until Luffy spoke again. Remember, Kobe, power can turn good people bad. Luffy finished, allowing Kobe to think about what he just said. They walked in silence until they made it to the gates of the marine base, where Luffy told the guard posted there that they were there to cash in the bounty on Alvida's head. The guard then took them into the base to the cashier, who gave them odd looks after seeing Alvida laying on a thunder cloud with lightning binding her. After verifying that as was her, the cashier gave Luffy a bag with 5 million belly inside, to which Luffy tucked away in his coat. Luffy and Kobe began exiting the marine base when Luffy noticed something in the corner of his eye. As they were walking, Luffy looked to the left to see in the open courtyard as a man tied to a post. Luffy smiled to himself. So, that's Roronoa Zoro, he thought to himself before looking straight ahead as they were about to exit the base. As they exited the base, Kobe was about to say something to Luffy but never got the chance to, as Luffy turned left and began walking along the walls until he suddenly stopped in front one of the walls and started climbing it. Kobe started to panic and scream at Luffy. Luffy, what are you doing? Someone will see you, yelled a panicking Kobe, but instantly became silenced by the words that came out of Luffy's mouth next. So, there you are, Mr. Pirate Hunter, Luffy said as he looked at the man strapped to the cross. Kobe turned pale as he looked over the fence in hope that Luffy was mistaken someone else of the demon, but from one look of the man, Kobe instantly knew he was the pirate hunter Roronoa Zoro. Zoro was a muscular young man of average height with lightly tanned skin and green hair. He has 3 identical gold earrings on his left earlobe and a green bandana tied around his head. He wore black trousers tucked inside black boots, a plain white shirt with 3 undone buttons at the collar, and his green haramaki. The two of them were knocked out of their observation by Zoro's voice. Hey, you two, he said, getting their attention, you're an eyesore. Get lost, he said in a cold voice, making Kobe scream while Luffy just looked bored. Luffy, let us just get out of here, Kobe said to Luffy, who simply ignored him. Then suddenly the two of them heard something hit the side of the wall to their left. When he looked to see what it was, they saw a little girl with a ladder climbing the wall. She then looked towards Luffy and Kobe before she placed her index finger to her lip, telling them to be quiet. Luffy could only stare at the girl as he threw a rope over the wall and climbed over. The little girl then began running towards Zoro with a huge smile on her face. She then reached in front of Zoro, who didn't look happy to see her. What do you want? He said to the girl in a harsh voice, trying to scare her, but the little girl just kept on smiling. I thought you may be getting hungry now. So, I made you a couple of rice balls, she said as she looked at Zoro. You got a death wish, kid. Scram, he said to her, but she didn't look like she was going to budge an inch. But you haven't eaten anything the whole time you've been tied up. Here, she said as he held up 2 rice balls. I never really made them before, but I did my best, so I think they're fine. She said, trying to convince Zoro to take the rice balls. Listen, kid, I'm not hungry. Now stop irritating me and get lost. Zoro yelled at the girl. The little girl's smile vanished for the first time and was replaced with a frown before she spoke. But, she began before Zoro interrupted her. Do not make me kick your ass, little girl. Zoro yelled, causing Luffy to narrow his eyes at him. Suddenly the gates of the marine base began to open and 3 figures could be seen entering. Now, no one likes a bully, said the man in the middle of 2 marines. Rorno Zoro, you seem to be handling this well. Don't you agree? Luffy narrowed his eyes at the group that just entered the base. For some reason, he didn't have a good feeling about them. Looky here, some tasty rice balls, said the man in the middle as he snatched one of the little girl's rice balls. That's not for you, the little girl screamed at the man. The bit down on the rice ball and the face he made soon after told Luffy that those rice balls did not taste good. He was right, as the man immediately spat it out. Ah, too sweet. It's packed with sugar. You're supposed to use salt, you idiot. Salt. The man screamed at the little girl. The little girl looked as though she had just had her heart broken. But I thought it would taste better sweet, the little girl said sadly. The man then snatched the other rice ball from the girl and threw it on the floor before stomping on it, causing the little girl to cry. It seems you haven't read the notice posted today. Anyone found aiding a criminal in any way will be executed. Signed, Marine Captain Morgan, the man said, causing the little girl to flinch when he mentioned Morgan's name. The man chuckled at her reaction before speaking again. It seems even you know my dad's name. This got Luffy's attention. So, he is Captain Morgan's son, Luffy said to himself, but loud enough for Kobe to hear. Does that mean he isn't a Marine? Kobe asked. I don't know. However, I highly doubt it, seeing as he isn't in Marine uniform, Luffy said as he looked at Kobe. When he turned back to the courtyard, he saw one of the Marines that were there with Morgan's son pick the little girl up and tossed her over the fence, causing Luffy's eyes to widen. He quickly turned his body into lightning and teleported to catch the little girl. He caught her midair and landed with her in his arms safely. The little girl smiled at him before she spoke. Wow, thank you, mister, she said happily. Kobe came rushing over to Luffy and the little girl. Kobe, why don't you take this little girl home? There is something I have to do, said a serious Luffy as he turned his body into lightning and vanished. Zoro, who was still tied to the cross, was startled when lightning suddenly struck the ground and the man who had been on the fence earlier appeared in the spot that the lightning had struck. The only thing he could do was stare at the man with eyes the size of dinner plates. How did you do that? Zoro asked. Luffy kept a serious look on his face as he spoke. I ate a devil fruit, said Luffy. Zoro nodded to show that he understood. He had heard of devil fruits but never actually thought they existed. Zoro then looked at Luffy with a serious look before speaking. So, what do you want? He asked. Luffy didn't say anything for about a minute. He just stared at Zoro through narrowed eyes before speaking. Are you really as strong as people say? Luffy asked. Mind your own business, Zoro yelled, causing Luffy to sigh. 10 days, huh? I'll be back, said Luffy before he turned to leave but was stopped by Zoro's voice. Wait, hold on, he said, getting Luffy's attention. Could you pick that up for me? He asked while looking at the crushed rice balls on the ground. Luffy looked at him like he was crazy. You're going to eat this? Luffy asked as the bent down and picked up the squished rice ball. It's mostly mud, he said, causing Zoro to yell at him. Shut up and give it to me. Now, he yelled, causing Luffy's eye to twitch. Luffy then picked up the rice ball and fed it to him while doing his best not to stab a lightning-coated fist through Zoro's chest. After Zoro ate the muddy rice ball, he looked to meet the emotionless eyes of Luffy before speaking once more. Tell the little girl they were delicious, he said. Luffy didn't show any emotion on the outside but he smiled on the inside. He then turned his body into lightning and teleported to Kobe and the little girl. Time skip. 2 hours later. Zoro was looking up at the clouds in the sky as they passed by when suddenly out of the clear blue sky, Zoro saw a bolt of lightning coming towards him. His eyes widened and he started trying to get free of the ropes. The bolt of lightning then struck the same spot that it had struck 2 hours ago. And people said lightning doesn't strike the same place twice. Zoro thought jokingly to himself as he looked up to see the same man from before standing there with the same emotionless look on his face, but this time Zoro noticed something different about the man. He couldn't figure out what was different. He had the same straw hat on his head, the same captain's coat, the same sword on his side, along with the same gun. Everything was the same down to the emotionless look on his face, but it was at that very same time Zoro was able to get a look of the man's eyes. Before they lacked any ounce of emotion, they were the cold eyes of a man who would kill you without a second thought, but now, however, his eyes were filled with anger. Zoro didn't know what scared him more, the thought of this man being able to kill anyone without a second thought when he is going about his normal day, or the thought of that same man being angry. Zoro decided to swallow his fear and speak. "You again, what do you want?" Zoro asked. Luffy began walking forward until he stood only a few feet away from Zoro before he spoke. "I have an offer for you," Luffy said, surprising Zoro. That idiot's son was never planning on following through on his end of the deal. He was going to have you executed tomorrow, Luffy said, causing Zoro's eyes to widen before he started thrashing around and yelling. "That sniveling little bastard," he yelled. "When I get my hands him he is going to wish his daddy had flushed him down the toilet like he should have," Zoro said, causing Luffy to chuckle before he spoke. "And how are you going to do all that tied up her?" Luffy said with a smirk on his face before continuing. "By the way, when I heard he was going to execute you tomorrow I knocked a few teeth down his throat. So, there is a good chance your execution got moved up to today," Luffy said, causing Zoro's eyes to widen even further. "Untie me so I can kick that bastard's ass," he yelled, causing Luffy to chuckle once more. "This is where my offer comes in. I can untie you and let you live, but you're going to have to join my crew," Luffy said, causing Zoro to clam down a bit before speaking. "What crew?" he asked. "I am putting together a pirate crew and I am looking for people to join up." "So, what's your answer?" Luffy asked. Zoro stayed silent for a minute before answering. "Listen, that idiot's son took my swords. If you can get them back I'll join your crew," Zoro said, causing Luffy to smile before turning his body into lighting and teleported away. Upon the roof of the marine base, every marine that was present on the base could be seen raising a giant statue of Captain Morgan made of stone. Standing off to the side looking at his men working was the captain in charge of the marine base, Axe Hand, Morgan. Morgan was a very tall and muscular, intimidating man with blonde hair and a steel jaw. His right hand is replaced by a huge steel axe, the handle of which seems to go right through his forearm. He wore a large, billowing coat like a cape, laying on the ground behind Morgan the crying form of his son Helmeppo. "Now stand it up, men. Display my greatness for the world to see," Morgan yelled at his men. As the Marines were in the process of pulling the giant statue upright, a bolt of lightning struck the center of the statue, causing everyone's eyes to widen. Just when everyone thought things couldn't get any stranger, standing in the spot where the lightning had struck was Luffy, looking at everyone. "What is this god-awful thing that I am standing on?" Luffy asked as he started examining the statue before he spoke. "No one will miss something this ugly," he said as he raised his right leg in the air and coated it with armament hockey. He then stomped his leg on the statue, causing every marine there to start sweating. At first, it looked like nothing happened, which caused a few marines to release a sigh of relief, but after 5 seconds later the entire statue suddenly crumbled to dust. Morgan was shaking with rage before yelling out, "Kill him," he yelled, and every marine drew their weapons. When everyone looked at the spot that Luffy was standing, they saw that he was gone from there and was now standing by the door with Helmeppo. "I need you to show me where Zoro's swords are," Luffy said as he began walking through the door with Helmeppo over his shoulders. Luffy was calmly walking through the halls of the marine base as though he didn't have a trouble in the world. "Where are Zoro's swords?" Luffy asked Helmeppo. "They are in my room. It is the door coming up on your left," Helmeppo said. As they stood in front of the door, Luffy kicked it open before tossing Helmeppo inside. Luffy then sent a wave of Conqueror's Haki towards him, making him pass out. Luffy looked around the room and noticed it was extremely girly. The walls were pink, the furniture was pink with flowers on them, everything about this room said it belonged to a girl. Luffy though Helmeppo lied to him and took him to the wrong room, however, when Luffy saw the 3 swords braced against the wall he knew he was in the right place. Luffy grabbed the swords and looked out the window to see something that made his eyes widen. Standing in the courtyard where Zoro was tied up was a very scared Kobe surrounded by Marines along with Morgan himself. The Marines were beginning to take aim to fire on Zoro and Kobe. Luffy opened the window and immediately turned his body into lightning before teleporting to the courtyard. Kobe and Zoro stared as the Marines took aim and were prepared to fire their guns when all of a sudden Luffy appeared in front of them with his usual lightning strike, putting Kobe and Zoro at ease for a bit while startling the Marines. "Fire at the kid with the straw hat!" Morgan yelled at his men. Luffy immediately covered his body in armament haki and waited for the guns to fire. He didn't have to wait long because, seconds after Morgan gave the order, every Marine with a gun pulled the trigger. What happened next made everyone's eyes widen. The bullets that were fired at Luffy hit him but did no damage. They simply fell to the ground squished as though they hit a metal wall. "That won't work on me," Luffy said as he stared at them with the cold eyes of a killer. "Just who are you?" Zoro asked with eyes the size of dinner plates. Luffy turned him and used one of Zoro's swords to cut him free before speaking. "The name is Monkey D. Luffy," Luffy said as he handed the swords to Zoro, "and I'm going to be king of the pirates." Before Zoro could say anything to Luffy, Morgan gave his men new orders. "If bullets won't work, then use your swords." As he said that, all the Marines drew their swords and charged Luffy, Zoro, and Kobe. Before they could reach the Luffy and Kobe, they were intercepted by Zoro, who held off each of their swords with all 3 of his. Luffy was amazed by the fact he was using 3 swords. Zoro held 2 katanas in his hands while the third one he placed in his mouth. Luffy was brought out his observation by Zoro's voice. "Make one move and you die," Zoro said to the Marines in a cold voice that made a few of them start crying. He then turned his attention towards Luffy before speaking again. "Today I officially become a criminal because I fought against the Marines. So, I'll become a pirate, that I can promise you, but I want you to know one thing. While I am with you, I dedicate myself to as fulfilling my ambition," he said. Luffy turned and looked at him before speaking. "Which is?" Luffy asked. Zoro smiled and spoke with a lot of determination. "To become the world's greatest swordsman and nothing less," he said, acting Luffy smile before replying. "The king of the pirates would have no less on his crew," Luffy said. Luffy and Zoro were once again interrupted by Morgan's voice. "What are you waiting for? Men, kill them," he yelled. All of his men backed away from Zoro, allowing him to stand up before they spoke in a scared tone. "Sir, we can't beat them," said one Marine. "Yea, they're monsters," said another one. "We will only die if we face them," said one more Marine. By now Morgan was shaking with rage. "This is a direct order. Every Marine who is spouting weakness, pull out your gun and shoot yourself in the head," Morgan yelled. At first, Luffy thought he was crazy to give an order like that because no one was stupid enough to follow such an order, but Luffy was surprised when he saw the Marines actually brought their guns up to shoot themselves. "What a bunch of idiots," Luffy thought to himself as he watches the Marines shakingly held up their guns to shoot themselves. Luffy quickly sent out a controlled blast of Conqueror's Haki towards the Marines, making each of them pass out on the ground foaming at the mouth. Morgan's eyes widened when he saw his men passing out. He looked to see if it was Zoro who did something, but Zoro was just as much surprised as he was. He then looked towards Luffy only to see him calmly walking towards him. "A leader who cares so little for the lives of his own men is nothing but scum," Luffy said in a tone that sent shivers up Morgan's spine. Morgan quickly caught himself and swallowed his fear before speaking. "They were weaklings. All that matters in this world is power and titles. A weakling like you could never understand that," Morgan yelled before charging towards Luffy, but stopped dead in his tracks when Luffy spoke. "That downwards chop from your right hand won't do anything," Luffy said, making Morgan's eyes grew wide as dinner plates. While Morgan was frozen in fear, Luffy never stopped once while walking towards him. Luffy then covered his palm in lighting before disappearing from everyone's sight. Luffy then appeared to Morgan's right, and with his lighting-coated palm he sliced off Morgan's right hand from his elbow. Morgan yelled out in pain and tried to jump back to put some distance between him and Luffy, but he didn't get to go far because Luffy was already behind him with his arm pulled back ready to strike. "Chidori!" he yelled as he stabbed his hand through Morgan's chest. Zoro and Kobe stared wide-eyed as they watched Luffy pull her hand from Morgan's chest, letting his lifeless body lay there in a pool of his own blood. Luffy then pulled out a handkerchief from his coat and began wiping the blood off his hands. He then looked at the dead body of Morgan before speaking in a cold, emotionless voice. "Scum like you don't deserve to live," he said before he began walking back towards Zoro and Kobe. As he was walking back towards them, the marine soldiers who were unconscious on the ground began to regain consciousness. When they woke up and saw the body of their dead captain on the ground instead of them trying to extract revenge on Luffy like he had expected, they began cheering and thanking Luffy for freeing them from Morgan's reign. "It seems they were all scared of Morgan before we showed up," said Kobe, getting Luffy's attention. Just as Luffy was about to reply, he heard something hit the ground next to him. When he looked over to see what it was, his first mate passed out on the ground. "Well, we better get him some food," said Luffy as he picked Zoro up and slung him over his shoulder before heading to the bar that the little girl from earlier, who he learned was named Rika, mother owned. Time skip. 15 minutes. "Oh, I am stuffed," said Zoro as he sat at the table with an empty plate in front of him. "Having not eaten in 3 weeks, I was ready to munch down on my boots strap," he said, earning giggles from Rika and her mother. Luffy sat across from him with a bottle of whiskey and a glass half filled with whiskey. Luffy couldn't help but smile at his first mate antics. Zoro then turned towards Luffy and spoke. "So, how many others have you gathered for this crew beside me?" Zoro asked. Luffy took a sip of his whiskey before reply. "Just you," he replied before taking another sip of his whiskey. Zoro looked at Luffy like he was crazy. "So, you and I are what amounts to a pirate crew?" Zoro asked. "I can take on an entire fleet of Navy battleships by myself, and when I am done with you, you will be able to do the same," Luffy said in a serious voice. If anyone else had said something like that, Zoro would have thought they were crazy, but after meeting Luffy, Zoro doesn't think anything can surprise him anymore. Just as Zoro was about to say something, a group of Marines entered the bar and looked Luffy, who didn't look all that bothered by their presence. "Hey, you there, we heard you fellas are actually pirates. Is this rumor true?" A Marine who Luffy guessed was the highest-ranking officer on the base after Morgan said. "Yay, we are," Luffy replied before taking a sip of his whiskey. "We appreciate everything you did to save our town from that horrible tyrant who terrorized us all for so long. However, now that we know you are pirates, as Marines we cannot sit idly by and watch you go about your business. Therefore, you and your crew will need to leave this town immediately, and out of respect for what you have done, we will not report you to headquarters," said the Marine, causing the people who were outside to begin to protest. Luffy then raised his hand, getting all of them to be quiet before he spoke. "That's okay everyone, we were planning on leaving anyway. However, before we go, there is something I need to do," Luffy said before he reached into his coat, making all of the Marines there nervous. He then pulled out a transponder snail and placed it on the table before dialing a number. The snail began to ring for about 10 seconds before someone picked out. "Hello," said a man on the other end of the transponder snail. Luffy smiled before replying. "Is this Vice Admiral Garp?" Luffy said, making every Marine and civilian's eyes to widen the size of dinner plates. "This is him." "Who is this?" Garp asked. Luffy grinned before replying. "Your grandson," Luffy said, making everyone's jaw dropped. Luffy chuckled at their reaction. "Luffy," Garp yelled through the transponder snail, "you brat, how dare you leave the island and join that red-haired bastard, huh?" Garp said, making Luffy roll his eyes before replying. "I miss you too, Grandpa," Luffy said with a smile, making Garp chuckle. "Anyway, I called because I knew you always wanted me to join the Marines, but that's not going to happen," Luffy said, making Garp growl on the other end of the line. "However, I found my replacement for you," Luffy said while looking at Kobe, making his eyes widen. "Oh, and just who is this replacement?" Garp asked. "A kid named Kobe. He is a bit weak and a bit of a coward, but I think you'll like him," Luffy said. Garp didn't say anything for about 30 seconds before he sighed and replied. "I'll take him, and just you watch, when I'm done with him he'll kick your ass up and down the Grand Line," Garp said, making Luffy chuckle. He is in Shell's Town in the East Blue. By the way, Shell's Town is going to need a new Marine captain. I had to kick Morgan's ass, Luffy said. I don't even want to know why, Garp said. Luffy smiled before speaking again. Well, I got to go, Gramps. I'm sure you and I are going to cross paths soon, so, until then. Luffy said, making Garp chuckle. Take care of yourself, brat, Garp said before hanging up. Luffy placed the snail back in his coat before standing up and walking over to Kobe. He reached in his coat and pulled out the bag of money he got from Alvida's bounty and handed it to Kobe before he spoke. Here, take this, you deserve it after all she put you through, Luffy said, making Kobe's eyes filled with tears. Kobe didn't get to say anything before Luffy turned towards Zoro and spoke. Get your things, we are leaving, he said. Zoro then grabbed his swords and stood up to leave. Luffy then turned to the Marines and spoke. Take care of Kobe until my grandfather shows up, will ya? He said as he and Zoro began walking out the door. The Marines could only nod their head dumbly. As they are walking down the road towards the docks, Luffy began summoning his Thunder Cloud. When they arrived, Zoro had his jaw on the ground at the sight of a Thunder Cloud. He almost passed out when Luffy got into the cloud. That's your ship, Zoro stuttered out. Luffy chuckled before speaking. It's temporary until we get a real one, he said as Zoro got in and sat in the seat that Kobe sat in while Luffy was on his throne. Well, Captain, where to next? Zoro asked as he sat his swords down in the cloud. Orange Town. I need to see a certain clown, Luffy said in a serious voice. Chapter 4. A Chop Man and a Thief. Luffy and Zoro were traveling towards Orange Town at about 80 miles per hour, just about 20 feet above the water. Zoro was laying back in the cloud napping while Luffy was sitting on his throne with a glass of whiskey in his hand looking up at the sky. Luffy then turned to the sleeping form of Zoro and spoke. Oi! Wake up, Luffy said, causing Zoro to turn over on his side while mumbling something Luffy couldn't understand. Luffy then took on an evil smirk on his face before pointing his right index finger at Zoro. At the tip of Luffy's index finger, electric blue sparks could be seen building up before a small bolt of lightning shot out of Luffy's finger and slammed into Zoro's behind, causing him to yelp in pain. Zoro immediately sprang to his feet with all three swords drawn ready for an attack. Luffy had an amused look on his face as he looked at Zoro. He gave a small chuckle before speaking to his first mate. Relax, Zoro, it was me, Luffy said, making Zoro resheathed his swords before yelling at Luffy. Why the hell did you do that? Zoro yelled. I tried waking you up the normal way but you wouldn't wake up, so I had to get creative, Luffy said as he took a sip of his whiskey. He then tossed a cup towards Zoro before speaking again. The barrel on your right has food and the one on your left has booze, Luffy said while pointing at the two barrels that Lucky Roo gave to him. Zoro thanked him before taking some meat from the barrel to eat along with a cup of booze to drink. While Zoro was eating, Luffy thought it would be a good idea to let him know the plan going to Orange Town. We are going to arrive in Orange 2 in about 30 minutes. The pirate who we are going there to see is Buggy, the clown. He has a 15 million belly on his head, Luffy said, making Zoro take on a serious look on his face before speaking. And why exactly are we going to meet him? Zoro asked with a raised eyebrow. Luffy took a sip of his whiskey before replying. I've heard a lot about him from my mentor. If he is as good a pirate as I expect him to be, I'll ask him to join the crew. If he is not, however, we kick his ass and cash in the bounty on him and his crew, Luffy said with a smirk. Zoro took a bite into the piece of meat he had in his hand before giving Luffy his opinion. And what if he is the pirate you expect him to be, but he doesn't want to join the crew? Zoro asked. Simple, we kick his ass and take his bounty, Luffy said, making Zoro chuckle. From now on, anyone with a bounty on their head we are going to cash in. In this cloud right now there is 800 million belly that I got from a few pirates in the Grand Line, Luffy said, making Zoro spit out all of the booze he had in his mouth and look at Luffy with eyes the size of dinner plates. 800 million belly? Zoro asked in a surprised voice, to which Luffy nodded before speaking. Yay, I plan on clearing out the big bounties in the East Blue before we head into the Grand Line. I highly doubt we will find a suitable ship that will survive the Grand Line. To a lot of that money will be spent on first buying a ship, repairing it, and then eventually we are going to need a new one. However, If we are lucky to find one that could survive the Grand Line, then all we will need to worry about is the repairs, Luffy said, earning a nod from Zoro saying he understood. That being said, getting a ship and maintaining it is my responsibility as captain, so any opponent the crew face that has a bounty on their heads gets to keep the bounty for themselves. The treasure looted is divided among the crew equally, Luffy said. Zoro drank the last of his booze before speaking. That sounds good, Captain, Zoro said with a smile, making Luffy smile as well. The two of them traveled for about 10 more minutes before they reached the shores of the Orange Town, or what used to be Orange Town. The entire town looked like a tornado passed through it. Zoro and Luffy stepped out of the cloud and began walking into the town. While walking, Luffy sent a command to the cloud to stay in the skies about the island. When they reached the down, they realized that it was abandoned. There was not a soul in sight. The only thing there was a lot of destroyed houses and vandalized buildings. Luffy sighed and tilted his hand down a bit to cast a shadow over his eyes before he spoke in a cold, menacing tone. It would seem Buggy is not the man I thought he was, Luffy said as they continued to walk through the town. Seems we will be 15 million belly richer than we were a few minutes ago, Luffy said, causing Zoro to chuckle. Hopefully there is someone strong on his crew for me to face, said Zoro while placing his hand on his swords. Luffy and Zoro were brought out of their conversation by a group of people running towards them. It appeared to be 3 members of Buggy's crew were chasing a girl about Luffy's age. The girl had short hair with a particularly curled strand over the left side of her face, and she was about 5 feet 6 in height. She wore an orange mini skirt with 2 white rings on each side filled in with orange and a short sleeve white shirt with blue stripes. Zoro and Luffy looked at the group with a curious expression on their faces. As the group got closer, Luffy saw a rolled up paper in the girl's hand that was about to size to be a map of some kind. It was then Luffy understood why she was being chased. She must have stolen an important map from Buggy and now he is going to kill her. Oh well, that's none of my business, Luffy thought as they kept walking forward. When the group got even closer, Luffy noticed the evil smirk on the girl's face as she looked at him and Zoro and couldn't stop himself from sighing. This girl is going to involve us, isn't she? Luffy asked himself. The moment Luffy finished his thought, the girl stopped in front of him and spoke in a relieved tone. Oh hey, boss, thanks for coming to save me, the girl said, earning a raised eyebrow from Zoro and Luffy as well as the 3 pirates that were chasing her. Before Luffy had the chance to say anything, the girl spoke again. They're all yours now, boss, have fun, she said before taking off running. Luffy sighed before he looked at Zoro and nodded. Before the 3 pirates knew what hit them, they were laying on the floor in a pool of their own blood while Zoro stood behind them resheathing his swords. What a pain, Zoro said as he looked over at Luffy. I thought you said I was the only member of your crew, Zoro said to Luffy. You are, Luffy said as they looked up on the roof of one of the houses and just kept staring there. Then who was that girl? Zoro asked as he walked and stood next to Luffy and looked at the roof of the house to see what he was looking at. No idea, Luffy said. As he said that, the girl from before popped her head over the roof to peep and see if Luffy and Zoro were dead yet. To her surprise, they were still alive, and the 3 pirates that were previously chasing her were laying on the ground an inch away from death. She then looked over at Luffy and shivered when her eyes met the cold eyes of the boy in the straw hat. She then took another look at the 3 pirates before speaking. You guys are really strong, she said as she jumped down from the roof and landed on the balcony of the house. Even though you were outnumbered and they had sabers, you were able to beat them, the girl said. Luffy kept the emotionless look on his face before he spoke. It's the girl who set us up a few minutes ago, Luffy said. Who are you? Luffy asked, causing the girl to put on a wide smile before replying. I'm a talented thief who steals strictly from pirates, the name's Nami, she said happily. Luffy was about to speak, but before he could, the girl spoke again in an excited tone. Hey, do you guys want to team up with me? She asked, sounding very excited by the prospect. Luffy turned around preparing to walk away before he spoke. Thanks for the offer, but I have no use for a thief, especially one who puts the lives to 2 innocent civilians in danger just to save her own skin, Luffy said before walking away with Zoro. Nami clenched her fist and looked down at the ground, feeling a bit ashamed when Luffy said that. She then looked up to see Luffy and Zoro walking away. These were two really strong guys who could really help her in achieving her goal, and she was not about to let an opportunity like this go to waste just because they saw a part of her that really wasn't her. She jumped off the balcony and yelled at them while running to catch up with them. "Wait, hold on, I'm not like that," she yelled while running towards them. "At least think about my offer for a bit before you reject it," she said as she finally caught up to them. Luffy and Zoro stopped walking and turned towards her before Luffy spoke. "Listen, Nami, I'm sure you are a nice girl and all, but like I said before, I don't have any use for a thief. Unless you have some other skill that may be useful on the open sea, I don't see us working together," Luffy said with a sigh. He knew he couldn't judge her based on that first encounter. That wouldn't have been fair for her. Nami smiled widely, which told Luffy she had a skill that may be useful. "I am the most skilled navigator you will ever meet," Nami said proudly with a huge smile on her face. Luffy looked at her and smiled back before speaking. "A navigator. Now that is someone I am looking for," said Luffy, making Nami's smile grew wider, but her smile immediately vanished when Luffy spoke again. "How about you join my crew? I have been looking for a navigator," Luffy said. The moment he said that, Nami stopped smiling and yelled at Luffy. "No," she said, confusing Luffy, "I take it you two are pirates?" she asked, earning a nod from Luffy and Zoro. Nami clenched her fist and yelled at Luffy and Zoro, "There is nothing in this world I despise more than pirates. I only like money and tangerines," she yelled out, causing Luffy to look at her with sad eyes. It was obvious that pirates did something to her or someone close to her. That was the common occurrence in the world. Pirates raid a village and destroy the lives of many innocent people, causing them to develop a sense of hatred towards all pirates. Luffy placed his hand on her shoulder before he spoke to her in a more comforting voice instead of his usual cold, emotionless one. "You know not all pirates are bad like the ones you met," Luffy said, causing her to look up at him with wide eyes. "How did you know I have met bad pirates?" she asked, yelled. Luffy sighed and looked around before he spoke. "Let us not talk in the open like this. I am sure you don't want Buggy's pirates to find you," Luffy said as he started walking towards one of the abandoned house. Zoro, who had remained silent throughout the whole ordeal, followed his captain into the house, and behind him, a very confused and angry Nami followed as well. The group entered the house that a family had abandoned in hope of getting away from Buggy. There were pictures on the wall of the family of four, along with a well-stocked liquor cabinet to which Luffy decided to examine. While examining the cabinet, Luffy's eyes were as wide as dinner plates. Zoro noticed and decided to check on his captain. "You okay there, Captain?" Zoro asked. Luffy took a bottle out of the cabinet and showed it to Zoro before he spoke. "This is a bottle of Suntory Yamazaki 12-year-old single malt whiskey," Luffy said excitedly, causing Zoro and Nami to roll their eyes at his behavior. "Yay, so what? It's just whiskey," Nami said, earning a gasp from Luffy. "Just whiskey. Just whiskey," Luffy yelled out, startling Namir and Zoro. In the short time that Zoro knew Luffy, he rarely if ever saw Luffy express any emotion. So, to see him here right now without the impassive look on his face was something Zoro knew he wouldn't see again for a while. "This bottle of whiskey cost 250,000 bilais," Luffy yelled out, making both of their eyes widen at the price. Nami's eyes turned into belly signs at the thought of selling that bottle. Luffy noticed the look in Nami's eyes and immediately shouted at her. "Don't you even think about it, Nami," he yelled, knocking her out of her thought. Luffy then walked over to the dining room table, sat down and poured some of the whiskey into a glass. He looked over to Zoro to see him with a bottle of sake in his hands as he sat down next to Luffy and guessed that Zoro prefers sake instead of whiskey. Luffy then looked at Nami, who didn't sit down next to them, opting to stand by the window and look out. Luffy took a sip of his drink and smiled at the taste. He was interrupted from his whiskey enjoyment by Nami's voice. "So, are you going to tell me how you knew I met a bad pirate?" she asked. Before Luffy could answer her question, she spoke once more again. "As far as I am concerned, all pirates are nothing more than scum. All they do is ruin the lives of innocent people and then leave happily," Nami said with a lot of anger and hate in her voice. Before she could speak again, Luffy decided to say something. "I'm guessing the pirates you've met were the scum of the earth and they hurt you or someone close to you. I can understand why you hate pirates so much, but you shouldn't judge all pirates based on your interaction with one," Luffy said as he looked at Nami from the corner of his eye. It was 10 years ago a group of pirates came to my hometown. At first we were all scared of them and thought they were going to raid the village and kill everyone, but instead, they were nice guys who played with the kids and helped out around the village. They stayed there for about 2 months and when they left they took me with them and taught me everything I know, Luffy said, surprising both Nami and Zoro. Nami looked at Luffy with complete shock and jealousy written all over her face. Why couldn't pirates like them come to our village instead of that monster? Nami thought to herself angrily. She was brought out of her thought by Luffy's voice. This straw hat was given to me by the captain of the pirate crew as a promise. A promise to meet each other again when I become king of the pirates. Luffy said as he held the straw hat in his hand while smiling fondly at it. I cherish this hat more than my own life. It's my treasure, Luffy said as he places the straw hat back on his head and turned to Nami and spoke. So Nami, join my crew and let's turn this whole world upside down, Luffy said with a huge grin on his face. Nami saw his smile and couldn't stop herself from smiling back at him. I will never stoop so low as to become a pirate, Nami said, causing Luffy to frown. However, she continued, making Luffy's face brighten up once more in hope of her joining. I don't see why we can't team up in order to achieve our common goal, Nami said, making Luffy smile widely at her before he looked to Zoro and raised his glass. Here is to our new navigator, he said as him and Zoro drank what was left in their glasses. Luffy then stood up, took the expensive bottle of whiskey and placed it into his coat. Nami saw this and looked at him strangely. Luffy saw the way she was looking at him and spoke. What? I'm a pirate, he said, causing her to shake her head. So, what is the order, Captain? Zoro asked as he stood up with his captain. Luffy dropped the smile on his face and took on his emotionless look once again before he spoke. Let's see Buggy and kick his ass, he said as he began to walk out of the house. Zoro smiled at the chance of a fight while Nami looked absolutely terrified. Be Buggy? She asked in a scared voice. Luffy looked at her and spoke. Yay, he is the reason we came here. I was going to ask him to join my crew, but after seeing what he has done here I am going to kick his ass, Luffy said as they continued to walk towards where Buggy and his crew were staying. The group walked for about 3 minutes when they finally arrived in front of a drinking pub which Buggy and his crew seemed to have occupied the roof of the place. Luffy looked up at the roof and yelled out, Be Boogie. The music that was playing on the roof stopped and Luffy could see the silhouette of a group of people walking towards the edge of the roof. Finally, the group came into view and Luffy and the crew saw Buggy standing in the center of the group. Buggy was a slim, yet muscular blue-haired man with an appearance resembling that of a clown. He had a big red nose on his face which Luffy learned from Shanks as his real nose. Buggy's face was covered in makeup. He had crossbones going down his face forming an X. He also had 2 blue lines near both of his eyes, red lipstick and his Jolly Roger on his hat. In his pirate captain attire, he dons a striped white and red shirt with short sleeves, white gloves, a sash around his waist like many other pirates, and a pair of loose pants reaching to his calves, just above a pair of striped socks and pointy shoes. He also has a scarf around his neck. Hanging from his shoulders there is an orange, fur-lined captain's coat. On his head, he has an orange hat with his Jolly Roger on it, over a neckerchief with the same pattern of his shirt. Who is that shouting the name of the great Captain Buggy? Buggy asked as he stood on the edge of the building looking down at the group. Wow, Shanks was right, you do have a big red nose, Luffy said, pointing at Buggy's nose. Everyone on Buggy's crew started to sweat a bit and looked at Buggy with a fearful look in their eyes. What did you say about my nose? Buggy yelled while pointing at Luffy, and how dare you mention that bastard's name in front of me? Buggy asked again, even angrier than before. I said you have a big red nose, Luffy said, making Buggy sake with rage, and as for Shanks, I'm his apprentice, Luffy said proudly. Buggy stopped for a second before he started chucking, making Luffy raise his eyebrow. Men, prepare the Buggy ball, he yelled out to his men. His crew brought a cannon forward and aimed it at Luffy. Another crew member brought a red cannonball with Buggy's Jolly Roger on it and placed it into the cannon. Now fire the Buggy ball, he yelled, causing one of his crew member to light the fuse. Zoro then stepped forward and spoke. I got this, Captain, he said as he unsheathed one of his swords. As the cannon fired, the buggy ball was racing towards the group but was intercepted by Zoro, who sliced it into two halves, causing it to miss Luffy and Nami and hit the two buildings behind them. Buggy looked like he was about to throw a fit about his precious buggy ball being so easily cut, but Luffy spoke before he could. "You know, Zoro, I would like to avoid doing any more damages to this town. So, how about you let me handle the buggy balls from now on?" "Okay," Luffy said as he stared at the houses destroyed by that one ball. Luffy then turned towards Buggy and spoke. "You know, Buggy, you are not what I had expected. From what Rayleigh and Shanks told me about you, I expected you to be some legendary pirate with a 500 million belly bounty on his head. But instead, here you are in the weakest sea of them all, terrorizing innocent civilians. And to think you were once a crew member on Gall Roger's crew," Luffy said in a disappointed tone while surprising everyone there, from the members of Buggy's crew to Zoro and Nami. Buggy took on a fearful look before yelling out at Luffy. "Hey, be quiet about that. The Navy will execute me for sure if they find out about that," Buggy said. Before Luffy could say anything, Buggy's crew shouted out in unison. "Captain, you were a member of the King of the Pirates ship." They all shouted out in unison, making Buggy almost want to kill them. Luffy raised his eyebrow at their reaction before speaking. "Didn't tell your own crew," Luffy said while walking forward. "You are a disgrace to call yourself a captain, Buggy," Luffy said as he stood next to Zoro. Buggy was beyond angry. Luffy could have sworn he saw steam come out of his ears. Buggy then turned towards his crew and yelled out an order. "Fire another buggy ball," he yelled out, making a member of his crew load another one of the special cannonballs into the cannon and fire it at Luffy. Zoro was about to act, but Luffy put his hand up, making him stop to see what Luffy was going to do. Zoro then saw Luffy's forearm turn pitch black. Luffy then did something that made everyone present widen their eyes. He caught the cannonball with his bare hand before tossing it into the air for it to explode. Buggy's eyes were almost popping out of its sockets and his jaw was to the floor, but somehow he barely managed to stutter out something loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hockey," he said, causing Luffy to smirk before he replied. "Did I forget to mention I am from the New World?" asked smugly as he looked at Buggy's entire crew and sent a wave of Conqueror's Hockey, knocking everyone out except for Buggy, a man on a unicycle and a man who was trying to wake the unconscious lion. Buggy stared at his men as they fell one by one, foaming at the mouth. "The Conqueror's spirit," Buggy thought to himself before turning towards the man on the unicycle and yelling out orders. "Cabbage, kill them," he yelled, and the man now named Cabbage jumped off the roof with his unicycle and charged towards Luffy's group. Luffy turned toward Zoro and nodded. Zoro then ran forward to meet him with all three swords drawn. Luffy stood back and watched as Zoro and Cabbage fought. Luffy immediately picked up that Cabbage wasn't a true swordsman. Instead, he is a trickster who uses a sword. As the fight was going on, Luffy saw Buggy's hand was flying towards Zoro and quickly turned his body into lightning, surprising Nami and Buggy, and teleported just about Buggy's detached hand and stomped on it with his foot. He then looked up at Buggy and spoke in a voice that lacked any ounce of emotion. "If you want to fight someone, I'll happily fight you," Luffy said. Nami was watching the whole encounter with eyes the size of dinner plates. First, Luffy catches a cannonball with his bare hands, then he makes everyone pass out by just looking at them, then Buggy's hand detached from his body, and now Luffy turned his body into lighting. "These people aren't human," she thought to herself before yelling out to the group. "What are you people?" he yelled, making Buggy and Luffy look at her. Luffy was the first to speak. "I ate the rumble fruit. So, I'm a lightning man," Luffy said, surprising both Buggy and her. Buggy then cleared his throat and spoke. "I ate the chop fruit. I'm a chop man," Buggy said proudly. Nami never thought devil fruits were real. She always thought they were just stories that the pirates told. Luffy, seeing Nami's stressed out look, and decided to have her think about something else. "Hey, Nami," Luffy said, getting her attention, "why don't you handle the guy trying to wake up his lion? Seeing as how badly he wants that lion to wake up, tell me the lion probably does more of the fighting than him, so it should be easy. Plus he is not paying attention, so sneak up on him or something," Luffy said, knocking her out of her worrying only to have her yell at him. "And why should I do that?" she said. Luffy smiled at her before speaking. "Because, If you do, I will let you keep all the treasure we take from Buggy, Luffy said, making Nami's eyes turn into the belly sign before running off to the guy with the lion. Luffy then looked over at Zoro to see he had already beat his opponent and was now sitting against one of the buildings watching Luffy and Buggy. Help her if she needs it, he said, earning a nod from Zoro. Luffy then turned towards Buggy and unsheathed his sword, allowing Zoro to see it for the first time. It was a pitch-black katana with a thin line of sliver showing the sharpness of the blade. The katana looked like it could cut through gold like a hot knife through butter. Buggy saw the katana and smirked. The fool, didn't he hear me say I am a chop-chop man? Swords don't work on me, he thought as he watched Luffy raise his foot, releasing his hand from under it before he turned his body into lighting and appeared in front of Buggy with his sword in the air. Instead of dodging the attack, Buggy stood there unmoving. Luffy noticed this and changed his swing to only nick Buggy's cheek. When Buggy felt blood running down his face, he immediately felt it, making sure he was cut and not just feeling things. He then looked at Luffy with a fearful look and spoke. How? He asked. Luffy smiled and spoke. Because I am a lightning man, I control lighting. There isn't a metal out there that can withstand my lightning and not melt. Well, there is only two, Luffy said, surprising Buggy and Zoro. Gold, which my sword is obviously not made from, and ... Luffy then took on a smirk on his face before continuing. See Prism Stone, Luffy said, making Buggy's eyes widen. Luffy then touched the tip of the sword to Buggy's chest, causing him to drop to the ground, feeling as though all the energy in his body just left him. Luffy then channeled his lighting through his sword, causing it to light up with electric blue sparks before he spoke. Bind, he said, causing 3 bolts of lighting to sprout from the tip of his sword and wrap itself around Buggy, holding him in place. He then walked over to Kabaji and did the same thing to him and the man who Nami fought. Luffy then looked over to Buggy, who was struggling to get free of the binds, and spoke. Don't try, he said, getting Buggy's attention. Those lighting are infused with Haki, effectively neutralizing your devil fruit power, Luffy said, making Buggy's eyes widen in shock. He was about to scream, but Luffy spoke before he could. You see, I have an ability that other Logia users don't. I can infuse Haki into my element without having it being connected to me, Luffy said, confusing Buggy. Luffy saw the confusion and decided to elaborate. For example, Navy Admiral Aokiji is an Ice Logia user and he can infuse Haki into his ice, but he has to be touching his ice to do that, and the second he lets go of the ice, the Haki is gone from the ice as well. Me, on the other hand, when I let go of my lighting, my Haki is still there, Luffy said, surprising everyone there. Luffy then turned to his crew and spoke. We are going to cash in their bounty, then head to Gecko Island, Luffy said, earning a raised eyebrow from Zoro. Why are we going there? He asked. Luffy smiled and spoke. To pick up our sniper, he said. Chapter 5. A Liar and a Ship. Luffy, Zoro, and Nami are currently traveling on Luffy's Thunder Cloud towards Gecko Islands after cashing in the bounty on Buggy and his crew. Luffy had then split up the bounty between the 3 of them, with Zoro getting 8 million for defeating Kabaji, Nami getting another 8 million for defeating a man who Luffy learned was Moji the Beast Tamer, and Luffy got 15 million for defeating Buggy. Luffy had allowed Nami to keep half of the treasure she had found on Buggy's ship, while Luffy made her leave the other half behind for the townspeople. The group was about 2 miles off the northern shore of the island and were traveling at about 40 miles per hour. Soon as the island came into view, Zoro turned towards Luffy, who was sitting on his throne, and spoke. So remind me again, why are we going to this island? Zoro said, getting both Nami and Luffy's attention. Luffy looked at him and sighed before replying. Like I told you earlier, we are going to the island to hopefully pick up a sniper, Luffy said. Nami then looked at him with a raised eyebrow before she spoke. Hopefully, she asked. Luffy then nodded his head before speaking. I don't know if he is going to want to join. Hell, I am just hoping he is a sniper like his dad and want to be a pirate, Luffy said before he pulled out a glass and poured some whiskey in it and took a sip before he began to speak again. And we are going to try to get a ship on that island as well, Luffy said, causing Zoro to nod his head and trusting his captain, while Nami took on a disappointed look on her face. She then looked at Luffy and spoke. Why we need a ship? She asked. She ran her hands on the surface of the cloud. I mean, this cloud is way better, she said. Luffy looked at her with an impassive look on his face before he spoke in a monotone voice. You may feel it is way better because you aren't the one who is keeping it together and flying it, Luffy said. Nami didn't say anything else, she just turned and faced forward. After traveling for a few more minutes before they arrived on the shores of Gecko Island. As they stepped onto the shore, Luffy sensed 4 individuals hiding on the cliff above them. Be careful, we are being watched, he said, getting their attention. Zoro placed his hand on his swords while Nami placed her hand to her side, getting ready to pull out the staff she had folded and strapped to the inside of her thigh. Suddenly Luffy sensed an incoming attack and immediately pushed Nami and Zoro out of way, allowing the attack to simply pass right through him. Luffy then looked up to see a teenager standing at the top of the slope with his arms crossed. I am Usopp, leader of the invincible nation of pirates who rule over this island. You stand before a living legend, the most revered pirate who ever lived. I am the great Captain Usopp, the teenage boy said, causing Zoro and Nami to sweat drop at his introduction while Luffy smiled at his antics. Usopp was a slim tan-skinned teenager with medium-length black woolly hair, prominent lips, and a long nose. He wore an olive-green plaid bandana, a blue and white striped armband on his left arm, brown overalls with a white sash and no shirt underneath. He also carried with him a yellow satchel. If you dare try to attack this island, my arm of 8 million super pirates will squash you like bugs, Usopp said. As he said that, a bunch of pirate flags tied to sticks began to rise from the bushes on the cliff surrounding the shore. Luffy raised an eyebrow at this before he spoke. Don't you mean 3 little kids? Luffy asked. The moment Luffy asked the question, Usopp began to shake in his boots with sweat pouring down his face. From the bushes that the pirate flags were raised from, 3 little kids ran out screaming. Usopp turned to the running away kids and screamed. Hey, where are you going? He yelled. Luffy couldn't stop himself from chuckling. Some crew you got there, Captain Usopp, Luffy said mockingly. At the corner of his eye, he saw Nami bent down and picked something up before she spoke. A pirate using a slingshot, huh? Now I have seen it all, she said. Usopp got angry when she made fun of him using a slingshot. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a green slingshot before aiming it at Luffy. Shut your mouth, or I'll shut it for you. I am a proud man and I won't stand for it. This is your last warning, or you'll get to see why they call me Proud Usopp and not Pushover Usopp, he said as he pulled back on the slingshot and aimed at Luffy's head. You've already seen just how good I am with this thing. So, you know I can rival anyone carrying a pistol, he said. Luffy looked at him while placing his hand on his hat and tilting his head down a bit, causing the hat to cast a shadow over his eyes before he spoke in a chilling tone. Now that you've drawn your pistol, are you willing to use it? Luffy asked, causing Usopp to sweat a bit. Guns aren't for threats, they're for actions. Are you willing to risk your life for it? Because. Luffy paused before pulling out his own pistol and aiming it at Usopp before continuing. I sure as hell am, he finished, causing Usopp to shake in his boots. However, even though he was absolutely terrified, he did not drop his slingshot, he kept it aimed at Luffy. Luffy smirked before sending a small amount of lightning into the gun so he wouldn't kill Usopp and pulled the trigger. Faster than anyone could track, a bolt of lightning left the gun and traveled through the air before flying straight through Usopp's slingshot and collided with the pellet he had loaded in there, effectively destroying it. Everyone could only stare at the crumbling pellet with their jaw on the floor. Usopp dropped to his knee and looked at Luffy in awe. Luffy chuckled before he spoke once more. Nice shot, huh? He asked, making Usopp nod dumbly. Yay, your dad taught me how to do that, he said, making Usopp's eyes go wide before he tumbled down the cliff, causing Luffy and everyone else to sweat drop. You know my dad? Usopp asked as he got back up and dusted himself off. Luffy placed his gun back in its holster before he spoke. Why don't we go get something to eat and we can talk there, Luffy said. Usopp nodded his head before leading Luffy and his crew towards a restaurant per bar called Meshi. When they got to the bar, everyone ordered food and sat down to eat while they listened to Luffy tell Usopp stories about sailing with his dad. To say Usopp was amazed at the fact that his dad was the sniper for a Yonko's crew would be an understatement. Luffy looked at Usopp and can see that he was proud of his dad being a pirate. After they finished eating, Luffy was about to ask Usopp about buying a ship, but before he could speak, Usopp stood up, puffed out his chest before he began to speak. It is decided. He said at the top of his voice, "One day I too will travel the seas like my father and become a brave warrior." Usopp said with a determined look on his face. Luffy chuckled before he spoke to him. "Well, what a coincidence, I happen to be in search of a sniper for my crew. In fact, it is one of the reasons I came here," Luffy said, getting Usopp's attention. "Your dad said you would make a good addition to my crew if you ever wanted to become a pirate. So, how about it? Do you want to join my crew and let's turn this whole world upside down?" Luffy asked with a smirk on his face. Usopp looked scared and nervous at the thought of joining a pirate crew. He fidgeted around for a bit before he finally replied to Luffy. Can I think about for a while?" he asked softly. Luffy just nodded his head yes. Usopp was about to leave but Luffy's voice stopped him. "Hey Usopp," Luffy said, getting his attention, "do you know where we could purchase a ship?" Luffy asked. Usopp placed his index finger to his chin and began to think for a minute before he replied to Luffy. "There isn't any shipyard on this island. However, if you want to buy a ship, your best bet is to check the mansion up on that hill," he said while pointing out the window at the lone mansion on the hill. When Nami heard mansion, her eyes immediately changed into belly signs at the thought of the money that was in the mansion. She looked at Usopp and asked him a question. "Who lives in the mansion?" she asked. Usopp smiled brightly at her before replying to her. "An orphan girl named Kaya. Her parents died 3 years ago and she has been in a depression since then," Usopp said, making Nami look down sadly. "I have been visiting her every day trying to cheer her up ever since her parents died, and I am headed over there right now, so if you want you can come along and I'll introduce you," Usopp said. Luffy smiled and replied. "That sounds great Usopp," Luffy said as he and his crew stood up and followed Usopp out the restaurant. After walking up the hill for about 5 minutes, the group arrived at the mansion where Usopp led them around the side to the hedges and removed a piece of the hedge, creating a hole big enough for someone to crawl through. Nami looked at Usopp and spoke. "Why do I get the feeling that you are not welcomed here, Usopp?" she said, making Usopp chuckle nervously before replying. "Well, you see, the butler here doesn't really like me. So, I have to sneak in to talk to Kaya," he said. Luffy and Zoro couldn't stop themselves from bursting out laughing, making Usopp blush in embarrassment. After Luffy and Zoro calmed down, the group went through the hole in the hedge one by one and entered the yard. The group stood under a rather large tree at the side of the house. Usopp bent down and picked up a pebble and then proceeded to climb the tree. He threw the pebble at one of the windows of the house and suddenly it opened and a brightly smiling girl stuck her head out and spoke to Usopp. "Usopp, you came," she said happily. Usopp smiled back before replying. "Of course I came, and I brought some friends who came here to join the Usopp Pirates and meet you," Usopp said, pointing to Luffy and his crew standing at the bottom of the tree. "Kaya, this is Luffy, Nami, and Zoro," he said while pointing at each of them as he spoke. "And guys, this is Kaya." When he said that, Luffy and his crew waved at her, making her smile and wave back. Kaya was a slim and pale-skinned girl with blonde hair. She had wide brown eyes, that are of a sort of lighter shade, and she wore a pale long dress. Kaya looked at Luffy and spoke with a warm smile on her face. "It is nice to meet you all," she said. Luffy smiled at her and spoke in a kind voice that his crew had never heard him use in the short time they knew him. "It is a pleasure to meet you as well, Miss Kaya. However, this is more of a business meeting more than a social one," Luffy said, making Kaya raise an eyebrow before replying. "And what business do you have with me exactly?" she asked. Luffy took a step closer to the house before he spoke again. "It was brought to our attention that we would be able to purchase a ship from you," Luffy said while looking up at Kaya. Kaya took on a thoughtful look for a second before turning around in her room and began shouting someone's name. "Mary," she shouted, "could you come here for a second?" 10 seconds after she yelled out, Luffy heard someone open the door to her room. Luffy watched as a strange-looking man came and stood next to Kaya and spoke. "You called Miss Kaya," he said while looking at Kaya, not noticing everyone else who was outside. Kaya smiled at him before she replied. "Yes, I did. I would like you to meet a friend of Usopp," she said before pointing outside at Luffy and the gang. "This is Luffy and his friends. He is interested in buying a ship. Can you take him to the docks and show him our ship?" she asked, making Mary looked at the group a bit skeptical at first before nodding. Mary then exited the room and headed to the outside where Luffy and his crew were to lead them to the docks. Mary arrived outside with the group and spoke to them. "If you all would follow me, I will take you to the ship," he said. Luffy turned towards Nami and Zoro and spoke. "Why don't you guys stay here and keep Kaya company with Usopp while I go check out the ship?" he said. Zoro nodded, trusting his captain, while Nami also nodded her head because she thought it was boring to pick out a ship. Luffy then looked over to Mary and nodded his head slightly, telling him to lead the way. Mary then led Luffy towards the back of the mansion where they had their own personal docks for their use only. It was at the docks Luffy saw a beautiful ship docked. Luffy looked over to Mary and saw him with a proud smile on his face as he looked at the ship. As they got closer, Mary turned to Luffy and spoke. "This is the Going Merry," he said, pointing at the ship. "It is a ship I built all by myself," he said proudly. Luffy turned and looked at the ship, examining it every inch. The Going Merry was a Caravel-class ship designed by Mary and had a jib and a central steer rudder. The ship's armaments consisted of 4 cannons, 1 in the bow pointing forward, 1 in the stern, and 2 pointing to either side, and to top everything off, and the figurehead of the ship was a sheep's head. After examining the ship, Luffy came and stood next to Mary once more and spoke. "It's a beautiful ship," he said while looking at Mary. "How much for it?" he asked. Mary took on a thoughtful look for a few seconds before he replied. 80 million, he said, surprising Luffy at how cheap it was. "We don't really get to take her out that much anymore, and she is only sitting here collecting dust. So, if you were wondering why she is that cheap, that's why," Mary said, causing Luffy to nod his head. "I understand," he said before he walked up to the ship and placed his hand on it before he spoke. "However, I plan on going into the Grand Line, and a ship like this won't survive the Grand Line as it is right now," Luffy said, making Mary nod his head in an understanding way. Mary was about to speak, but Luffy spoke before he got a chance to. "I will pay 100 million for the ship if you can make a few upgrades to it," Luffy said, surprising Mary. "And what sort of upgrades do you have in mind?" Mary asked. Luffy looked over at him and spoke. "I noticed that the ship doesn't have a captain's quarters. I would like one to be added in," Luffy said, to which Mary nodded his head. "Also, the current cannons on the ship are of an older model. I would like for them to be replaced with new models. I would also like for the rudder to be replaced. Currently, as it is, would snap against a strong current," Luffy said. Mary made note of everything he asked for before he spoke. "I will also check the wood on the ship to see if any needs replacing. This won't make her survive the Grand Line, however, it should extend her lifespan a bit longer, allowing you to find a stronger ship," Mary said. Luffy nodded his head before he spoke again. "And how long will all these upgrades take?" he asked. Mary brought his finger to his chin and thought for a moment before he replied. "About 2 weeks or so. I will have the builders start on it right away," he said, making Luffy smile at him before he replied. "I would really appreciate that, thank you," Luffy said before the two of them made their way back to the mansion to meet up with the rest of the crew. As the crew came into view, Luffy and Mary saw that some sort of commotion was going on between Usopp and a rather well-dressed man who Luffy take to be the butler that didn't like Usopp. Luffy looked at Mary as they were walking there and spoke in an amused voice. "I take it that is the butler that Usopp said didn't like him?" he asked, causing Mary to chuckle before replying. "Yes, that is Clawhador," he said. As they got closer, they were able to hear Clawhador insult Usopp and his dad Usopp, causing Luffy's smile to immediately vanish from his face. Luffy saw Usopp was really close to hitting the guy and decided to let his presence be known by speaking. "You know, some might think you have a death wish for insulting a member of a Yonko's crew," Luffy said as he and Mary got closer. Clawhador and Kaya turned and looked at him with wide eyes. Clawhador quickly regained his composure and spoke to Luffy. "I do not know what you are talking about. I did no such thing," he said while staring at Luffy. Luffy walked up to him and stared at him in the eyes and spoke once more. "Usopp's father is the sniper and left hand to red-haired Shanks," Luffy said, surprising everyone there including Usopp. Usopp knew his father was on Shanks' crew, but he had never thought his father would be Shanks' third in command. Usopp was interrupted from his thought when Luffy spoke once more. "So let's be honest here. Do you really want to piss a Yonko off, butler?" Luffy said, putting emphasis on the butler part. Luffy could easily see in Clawhador's eyes that he was scared even though he kept his face stoic and emotionless. So what? The butler said, surprising Luffy. Even if he is the son of a member of a Yonko's crew, I highly doubt that a Yonko from the Grand Line will come all the way here to the East Blue for something like this, Clawhador said smugly. Luffy then gave a chuckle that sent shivers down the spine of the butler before he spoke. Why would Shanks need to come when I'm already here? Luffy said before pulling his coat back and lifting up the left side his red shirt, giving everyone there a look of his well-toned 8-pack abs. However, the thing that caught everyone's eyes wasn't his abs, but the tattoo that was on the left side of his abdomen. When Clawhador saw it, he immediately began to sweat. On the side of Luffy's abdomen was a tattoo of a Jolly Roger, but not just any Jolly Roger, the Jolly Roger of the red-haired pirates. Gee, that's... Clawhador stammered as he pointed at Luffy's tattoo. Luffy smirked before he spoke. The Jolly Roger of the red-haired pirates, yes, Luffy said before he pulled his shirt back down and looked over to his crew to see Zoro had a smirk on his face at the thought of how strong his captain was, while Nami had a slight blush on her face as she remembered Luffy's abs. Luffy turned back to Clawhador and spoke once more. You see, Shanks is practically my adopted father because he and his crew raised me for the past 10 years, and eventually I became part of the crew as well, hence the tattoo, Luffy said before he turned to Kaya and spoke. I will take the ship, Miss Kaya. I already spoke to Mary on some things I want to be done on it and we already agreed to a price. I am sure Mary will fill you in on everything, Luffy said as he turned to leave with his crew and Usopp. As Luffy was walking away he turned and looked at Clawhador and spoke in a deadly tone. If I ever hear you insult one of the red-haired pirates again I will kill you myself, butler, Luffy said before walking away with his crew. After leaving Kaya's mansion, the group was currently walking down the hill to head back to the village. While walking, Zoro noticed that Luffy was in deep thought and decided to ask his captain what was wrong. You okay there, Captain? He asked, knocking Luffy out of his deep thought. Luffy shook his head slightly before turning to Zoro and spoke. Huh, was all he said, showing that he wasn't paying attention to what was going on. Zoro raised his eyebrow and spoke again. I asked if you're okay. You look a bit distracted, he said, making Luffy nod his head before he replied. Yay, I am. There is something about that butler that is familiar, but for the life of me I can't figure out what is it about him that's so familiar, he said in a frustrated voice. Zoro then began to think and try to help his captain figure out what was familiar about the butler, but he came up empty as well. Nami, who was looking at the two of them, sighed and spoke to them. Maybe you are thinking too much into it, she said, getting their attention. Why don't we check into one of the local inns and get some rest? Maybe that will help you figure it out, she said, making Luffy nodded his head in agreement. Usopp took the three of them to a local inn and Luffy checked everyone in and ordered dinner for the three of them and Usopp before they all went to sleep for the night. Maybe a good night's rest will help me figure out why he is so familiar, Luffy thought before he closed his eyes and fell asleep. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment and subscribe, as well as checking out the author on fanfiction.net.